It was a bright morning when she decided to visit the bank. The air outside carried a quiet calmness, and she walked with confidence, holding her small folder close to her chest. Inside that folder were important papers she had been working on for weeks. She knew this visit was going to be just a routine task, nothing unusual, nothing that could take more than a few minutes. Her life was busy, her schedule always filled with important work, so she wanted this to be quick and smooth. As she entered the tall glass doors of the bank, she smiled politely at the security guard. The man nodded back, welcoming her with the same smile he gave to all customers. She stepped inside, noticing the line of people waiting, the soft sound of printers working, the gentle tapping of keyboards, and the murmur of voices as people discussed their financial matters with the staff. It was a usual day for everyone, but for her, that day was about to turn into something she had never imagined. She took a seat for a moment, patiently waiting for her turn. Dressed neatly and carrying herself with grace, she looked like any other customer who had come for a simple transaction. Yet, across the room, the bank manager noticed her. He was a man who often judged too quickly. Instead of seeing her as a professional woman who knew exactly what she wanted, he let his own bias cloud his judgment. Something inside him whispered doubts that had no truth. Instead of walking over to greet her or offer assistance, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. She stood up when her number was called and walked to the counter. The clerk spoke to her kindly, asking for her documents. She opened her folder carefully and handed over her papers. Every move she made was calm, clear, and polite. She spoke with confidence, her voice steady, her tone respectful. The young clerk looked at the documents and realized everything was in order, but just then, the bank manager stepped closer. He didn't speak to her directly at first. He leaned toward the clerk and whispered questions that were loud enough for her to sense. She noticed his doubtful expression, the way he frowned at her folder as if it carried something suspicious. She remained quiet, allowing him to inspect, believing that he was only being thorough. But in reality, he had already made up his mind. Without giving her the benefit of the doubt, he walked back to his office, picked up the phone, and made a call that would change the next hour entirely. While she sat there, quietly waiting for the clerk to process her request, the manager was secretly speaking to people he should never have called. He told them he had a customer who seemed suspicious, someone who might be connected to something unlawful. His voice was firm, as though he was protecting the bank from danger. But in truth, he had no evidence, no reason, no facts, only his own imagination driven by prejudice. The minutes passed slowly. She checked her watch, wondering why such a simple task was taking longer than expected. Around her, other customers came and went, completing their work and leaving with a smile. She adjusted her chair and glanced around the hall, still calm, still patient, but inside, she wished the process would speed up. The bank manager kept glancing at her from a distance. His eyes carried doubt, but his body showed a kind of false authority. He convinced himself that he was right, that calling higher officials was the safest step. He had no idea that the choice he made would soon backfire in the most unexpected way. Finally, the clerk told her there was a delay and that she should wait a little longer. She nodded, although she was puzzled. She trusted the system, trusted that everything would be fine. Little did she know that the manager had already set a chain of events in motion, one that would soon bring strangers through the door, strangers who would change the atmosphere of the bank completely. The sun outside kept shining, but inside the bank, a quiet tension was slowly building. The staff didn't know yet what was happening. The customers continued their conversations, counting their money, signing papers, and asking routine questions. She sat silently, her thoughts focused on the tasks she had planned for later that day. In her mind, this was still just a small delay, nothing else. But the bank manager's call had reached its destination. On the other end, officials listened, questioned, and finally decided to act. For them, it was better to respond quickly than to ignore a possible report. They prepared, not knowing the truth, not knowing who they were about to meet. Back inside, she adjusted her folder, smoothed the papers on her lap, and took a deep breath. She thought about the work waiting for her after this visit, the emails she needed to reply to, the meeting she had planned. She was completely unaware of the storm quietly approaching. Every story has a moment where everything changes, and that moment was only minutes away. The bank manager checked his watch nervously, waiting for what he thought would be his victory, the moment when the people he had called would arrive, and he would be proven right. He imagined himself being praised for his quick thinking, for his bravery. He had no clue that his actions were about to turn against him in the most powerful way. She continued to sit with quiet dignity, unaware that every eye would soon be on her. The calmness in her posture, the confidence in her silence, and the grace in her manner would soon become the strongest response to the doubt she had been treated with. What began as an ordinary day at the bank was already transforming into a story that many would never forget. And just as the clock's hand moved closer to the next hour, the sound of footsteps outside began to grow louder. The doors were about to open, and with them, the truth was about to enter. The calm inside the bank began to shift as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from outside. She sat quietly, still unaware of what was about to unfold. Her eyes glanced at the large clock on the wall. More than 30 minutes had passed since she first arrived, and what should have been a simple matter was now dragging on endlessly. She sighed gently, thinking perhaps the staff were just slow that day. But then, the glass doors swung open with sudden force. Several men in dark suits entered the building, their presence instantly felt by everyone inside. They were tall, sharp in their movements, and their faces carried the seriousness of people on a mission. The customers sitting in the waiting area turned their heads in surprise. Conversations stopped, pens were set down, and papers were left unfinished as everyone tried to understand what was happening. She looked up too, her eyes following the group that had entered. For a moment, she assumed they were just officials from another department, maybe there for an inspection. But the way they scanned the room, the way they moved directly toward her, made her heart skip a beat. The security guard stood straighter, clearly startled. The bank employees froze at their desks. The manager, however, felt a strange thrill of victory building inside him. He quickly stepped forward, trying to look important, as though he was the one who had invited them in. The men in suits walked toward her calmly but firmly. One of them called her name with a voice of authority. She was stunned. They knew who she was. She slowly stood up, her folder still clutched in her hands. Her mind raced with questions. Why were they here? Why did they know her name? Why was everyone staring at her now as though she had done something wrong? The room grew silent except for the sound of shoes on the polished floor. The customers whispered to one another, their eyes wide with curiosity. Some thought she might have been caught doing something illegal. Others simply watched, unsure but eager to see what would unfold. She remained composed, refusing to let her confusion show on her face. When the officials reached her, one of them asked her politely to step aside with them. His voice wasn't harsh, but it carried weight, the kind of voice that made people listen. She nodded and followed, her steps calm and steady, even though her thoughts were filled with uncertainty. The manager watched from behind, his lips curving into a smile of satisfaction. In his mind, he had been proven right. He imagined that soon, the whole bank would praise him for spotting what he believed was a threat. He didn't know that the truth was about to expose his mistake in front of everyone. They guided her a few steps away from the waiting crowd, but not too far. Everyone could still see her, and that made the moment even more intense. One of the officials opened a folder and looked at her documents, the same ones she had handed to the clerk earlier. Another spoke to her directly, asking simple questions about her identity and purpose at the bank. She answered with confidence, her voice clear, her tone steady. She explained why she had come, what her papers were for, and who she was. Every word she spoke was polite yet firm. There was no fear in her voice, only the quiet dignity of someone who knew her truth. The officials listened carefully. They compared her words with the information they already had. Slowly, their expressions began to change. The sternness in their eyes softened into respect. One of them even exchanged a knowing glance with another, as though silently confirming something important. The customers watched with growing curiosity. Some leaned forward in their chairs, trying to catch her words. The staff at their desks pretended to work but couldn't stop themselves from stealing glances at the unusual scene. The manager stood proudly, waiting for the officials to declare that he had been correct. He had no idea his pride would soon turn into humiliation. Then came the moment that no one expected. One of the officials looked at her with a gentle smile. He closed his folder, straightened his jacket, and in front of everyone, raised his hand to his forehead in a salute. The other officials followed, standing tall and saluting her with the same respect. The entire bank gasped. The sound of surprise filled the hall. Customers blinked in disbelief, unable to understand why the men in suits, who carried such authority, were showing respect to the very woman they thought was under suspicion. She stood gracefully, accepting their salute with quiet poise. She did not gloat, she did not boast, she simply stood with the dignity of someone who had nothing to prove. At that moment, the truth was revealed without a single extra word. The officials knew exactly who she was: a woman of high standing, a professional who had worked with government projects, someone who deserved honor, not suspicion. The clerk at the counter looked down in embarrassment, realizing how wrongly she had been treated. The customers whispered among themselves, some smiling, some shaking their heads at the unfairness that had led to this moment. The security guard's eyes widened in respect. But the manager, he felt his stomach twist. The color drained from his face as the realization hit him. His proud smile faded into shock, then into fear. The salute that was meant for her was the loudest silence against him. It was proof that his call had been built on nothing but bias. The officials turned toward him now. Their expressions carried no anger, but the weight of their silence was heavy. The manager tried to stand tall, but his body betrayed him. His shoulders sank, his confidence crumbled. Everyone in the bank could see what had happened. He had tried to bring shame to her, but instead, the truth had brought shame to him. She looked at him, her eyes calm yet sharp. She did not need to say a word. The respect she received was louder than anything she could have spoken. In that instant, she understood the power of truth, the strength of dignity, and the weakness of prejudice. The room, once filled with whispers, now held an air of awe. The customers looked at her with admiration. The staff members lowered their eyes, embarrassed for having followed the manager's lead. Even the clerk who had helped her earlier now realized how wrong the assumptions had been. The officials closed their folders, saluted her one last time, and then turned to leave. Their job was done, not because they had caught a criminal, but because they had confirmed the honor of someone who deserved it. She sat back down slowly, her posture still graceful, her heart steady. She knew the next steps would matter even more. The bank manager, now pale and trembling, stood in silence, wishing he could disappear. He had set this chain of events in motion, but the ending was nothing like he had imagined. What had begun as an ordinary day had turned into a scene no one would forget. The customers would carry the story with them, the staff would whisper about it for weeks, and the manager would never escape the lesson that was now burned into his memory. And for her, it was only the beginning of how she would turn this moment into something even more powerful. The silence inside the bank lingered long after the officials left. People were still whispering, still replaying what they had just witnessed. A young woman, once seen with doubt, had just been saluted with honor by men of authority. It was a moment so unexpected that everyone struggled to absorb it. For her, however, it was the beginning of a new test. She sat back in her chair, her folder resting on her lap, and looked around the room. Every eye that had once stared at her with suspicion was now filled with respect or guilt. She felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved that the truth had been revealed, that her dignity had been recognized. On the other hand, she could not ignore the unfairness that had led to this moment. The bank manager stood frozen near his office door. His earlier pride had vanished, replaced by the weight of humiliation. He could feel the stares of his staff, the quiet judgment of customers, and the heavy silence of the woman he had wronged. He had wanted to prove himself as careful and alert, but instead, he had shown himself to be unfair and reckless. The clerk who had helped her earlier walked over with trembling hands. She placed the papers back on the desk and spoke softly, her voice filled with nervousness. "Everything is in order, ma'am. We will process this immediately." She nodded without anger, though her eyes held a depth that made the clerk lower her gaze. Her patience, her calmness, and her refusal to create a scene were what made the moment even more powerful. Everyone in that hall understood something deeper now. Still, the journey was not over. The whispers in the room grew into conversations. Customers discussed what they had seen, retelling the event in their own words. Some were impressed by her composure, some were ashamed at how quickly they had believed the manager's doubts, and some simply marveled at the unexpected twist of events. For her, sitting there quietly, it was not enough to just let the truth be revealed. She knew there was a lesson here, one that needed to be taught not only to the manager but also to everyone who had silently judged her. She believed in fairness, in dignity, and in the power of standing strong against prejudice. The bank manager finally gathered the courage to walk toward her. His face was pale, his hands slightly trembling. He forced a small smile, but it disappeared almost instantly under the weight of her calm gaze. I only wanted to be cautious," he said quietly, as though trying to justify his actions. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence do the talking. The customers who overheard his words shook their heads. They knew what he was trying to do: cover up his mistake with weak excuses. She finally spoke, her voice soft but sharp. "Caution is not built on assumptions. It is built on truth. And today, truth has spoken." Her words spread through the hall like a quiet wave. People nodded, whispering to each other, admiring the way she carried herself. The manager lowered his eyes, ashamed, for he knew there was no defense strong enough to cover his actions. The rest of the day inside the bank was tense. The clerks worked quickly, their movements stiff and uneasy. Customers continued to glance at her, as though they were in the presence of someone far greater than they had first assumed. Some even offered her small smiles of respect as they walked out, carrying their own completed transactions. But for her, the real struggle was within. Though she had been honored in front of everyone, though the FBI had saluted her, the pain of being doubted so easily still sat heavy in her heart. It reminded her of how quickly people could judge without knowing, how easily suspicion could replace trust, and how dangerous assumptions could be. She thought about her journey, the hard work that had earned her recognition, the countless nights she had spent building her career, and the dedication she had given to her role. All of that was invisible in the eyes of someone who only saw what he wanted to see. That thought strengthened her resolve. She knew she could not let this pass silently. Later, when her documents were finally processed and she was free to leave, she stood up with grace. The room once again grew quiet. Every movement she made carried weight now, because everyone knew she was not an ordinary customer. She walked toward the exit, her step slow and steady. The security guard bowed his head slightly as she passed, a sign of respect that needed no words. But she stopped near the door. She turned around and looked straight at the manager. Her eyes locked on his, and the silence of the hall grew heavier. "This is not the end," she said calmly. "Actions have consequences. And today, you must face yours." The customers leaned forward in their seats, sensing something powerful about to unfold. The clerks froze at their desks, afraid to move. The manager's lips parted, but no words came out. He understood that she was not someone he could dismiss. She left the bank that day, but the impact of her words stayed behind. The story spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Customers told their families, who told others, and soon the whole neighborhood knew of the woman who had walked into a bank, been doubted, but left with respect that silenced everyone. The struggle, however, was not just about one incident. For her, it was about something greater: the fight for fairness, the fight to remind people that every person deserves dignity, and the fight against unfair judgments that could destroy trust. She knew she had to act, not just for herself but for everyone who might one day face the same unfairness. That night, she sat in her home, reflecting on the day's events. The memory of the officials saluting her filled her heart with pride, but the memory of the manager calling them filled her with determination. She wrote down her thoughts, planning her next steps carefully. She did not want revenge, she wanted justice. She wanted a lesson to be remembered, a change that would last. The bank manager, meanwhile, could not sleep. He tossed in his bed, haunted by the moment when the official saluted her instead of arresting her. His mind replayed the looks of disappointment from his staff, the whispers of the customers, and the calm but sharp words she had spoken to him. He knew his reputation had been damaged beyond repair. The days ahead would bring even more struggle. She was ready for it. She knew that strength was not just about facing challenges but also about turning them into opportunities. And this challenge had given her the chance to stand up not only for herself but also for countless others. Her story was no longer just about a simple bank visit. It had become a journey of strength, truth, and the fight for justice. And though the manager thought he had power, it was she who now held it in her hands. The struggle was not yet over. In fact, it had only just begun. The next morning, she woke with a sense of clarity. The events at the bank played in her mind again and again, but instead of anger, she felt a deep determination. She had been disrespected in a place where she had gone for something simple, yet the truth had turned that same place into a stage where justice had spoken loudly. Now, she knew it was time to act, to make sure such behavior never repeated itself, not with her and not with anyone else. She dressed with her usual grace and prepared herself for the day. Her thoughts were sharp and steady, her heart calm yet strong. She had faced unfairness, but she had turned it into dignity. That was her power, and now she was ready to use it. When she arrived at the bank again, everyone inside grew silent. The clerks paused in their work, the customers turned to look, and even the security guard straightened his posture, showing her the respect he had seen others give her the day before. The atmosphere shifted immediately. She was no longer seen as just another visitor. She was someone who carried authority, even without trying. The bank manager, however, looked uneasy. He had not expected her to return so soon, and his nervous glances betrayed his fear. He tried to smile as though nothing had happened, but everyone could see the uneasiness in his expression. He knew the moment of truth was near. She walked calmly to the center of the hall and spoke with a steady voice that carried across the room. Yesterday was a lesson for all of us. I came here for something simple, yet I was judged unfairly. Assumptions replaced truth, and doubt replaced respect. That cannot be accepted, not today, not ever. The customers listened intently, their eyes fixed on her. The clerks exchanged looks of shame, remembering how they had doubted her in silence. The manager's face grew pale, and he shifted uncomfortably in his spot. She turned toward him. You made a choice that could have destroyed my name, my peace, and my dignity. You acted without reason, guided only by your own assumptions. That was not caution, that was carelessness. And today, you must face the consequences. The room grew so quiet that even the sound of the air conditioner felt loud. Everyone waited to see what she would do. The manager tried to open his mouth, but no words came out. He knew there was nothing he could say that would defend his actions. She took a step forward, her presence commanding the entire room. In a place of trust, you brought distrust. In a place of service, you brought shame. You are not fit to lead here. From this moment, you no longer hold this position. The bank manager froze. The words struck him harder than he could have imagined. His body went stiff, and his eyes widened in disbelief. The staff gasped softly, unable to hide their surprise. The customers exchanged looks, whispering to one another. Her voice remained calm, but her words carried the strength of truth. Respect must live in every corner of this place. If a leader cannot give respect, then a leader cannot remain. The clerks nodded slowly, their hearts agreeing with her. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and they knew she was right. The customers felt inspired, watching her stand tall, watching her speak with such quiet yet undeniable power. The manager lowered his head, realizing there was no escape. His pride, his authority, his control, it had all collapsed in front of everyone. He had called the FBI hoping to bring her down, but instead, they had saluted her. Now, she was the one who decided his fate. She turned to the staff and said firmly, "From today, let this place become a place of fairness. Serve people with dignity, see them with respect, and never let assumptions decide your actions. Trust is the foundation of a bank, and trust can only exist where there is equality." The words struck deep into the hearts of the employees. Some lowered their eyes in shame, remembering how they had doubted her silently the day before. Others felt a new sense of responsibility rising within them. They knew this was a turning point, not just for the bank but for each of them personally. The manager, meanwhile, slowly gathered his belongings. His hands trembled as he picked up the files on his desk, his once proud shoulders now bent low. He walked past the staff, unable to look anyone in the eyes, and headed toward the door. Each step he took felt heavy, for he knew he was leaving not only his position but also the respect he had once claimed. The customers watched silently, their eyes moving from the manager's defeated figure to the strong woman who had spoken with such dignity. In their hearts, they knew they had witnessed something rare, a moment where truth defeated prejudice, where calmness overpowered arrogance, and where justice stood tall. After he left, the room felt lighter, as though a heavy shadow had been lifted. The clerks returned to their desks with a new sense of energy, determined not to repeat the mistakes of their former leader. The customers felt proud to have been witnesses to the moment, some even smiling at her with admiration. She stood there quietly, allowing the silence to settle. She did not celebrate, she did not boast, for her victory was not about pride but about justice. She had acted not only for herself but for everyone who might walk through those doors in the future. Her words echoed in the minds of all who were present: respect must live in every corner, trust can only exist where there is equality. As she walked toward the exit, people moved aside with quiet respect. The security guard opened the door for her with a small bow. The sunlight outside welcomed her warmly, as though the world itself recognized her strength. She stepped into the fresh air with a calm heart. She had faced the storm, and she had turned it into calm waters. She had been judged unfairly, but she had turned that judgment into a lesson for all. She had fired the manager not out of anger but out of justice, and that decision carried weight far beyond the walls of the bank. News of the event spread quickly, carried by those who had seen it firsthand. People told the story in markets, in offices, in homes. Some told it with admiration, others with awe, but all agreed on one thing: she had shown dignity, courage, and strength in a way few ever could. Her journey was not about revenge, it was about change. She wanted the world to learn that truth is stronger than doubt, that respect is greater than prejudice, and that courage can silence injustice. That day at the bank would be remembered not as a scene of conflict but as a moment of transformation. For the staff, it was the day they learned that service means equality. For the customers, it was the day they saw courage in action. And for her, it was the day she turned an insult into inspiration. The story was not finished yet, but she had already won a battle that mattered. And as she walked away from the bank, the world around her seemed brighter, not because the sun shone more strongly, but because truth had once again proven itself stronger than fear. The days that followed were filled with quiet change. What had happened inside the bank was not a small event that could be forgotten quickly. Customers carried the story with them, telling it to their families, friends, and neighbors. Staff members shared their feelings with each other, speaking about how the moment had opened their eyes. And the manager, who had once walked proudly through those doors, was now spoken of only with regret. But for her, life did not stop at that moment. She had not acted just to prove herself, she had acted to teach a lesson, to show people the power of truth and fairness. She wanted the story to inspire others, not just remain as something people talked about for a few weeks. Her phone began to ring more often. People from different communities wanted to meet her, to hear her thoughts, to invite her to speak. Journalists reached out, asking for interviews. Some wanted to know how she felt when the FBI saluted her. Others wanted to know how she found the courage to fire the manager on the spot. She answered each question with calm honesty, never exaggerating, never turning the story into something bigger than it was. She only shared the truth, and it was enough to inspire many. In one interview, she said, "I did not act out of anger. I acted out of responsibility. When unfairness is ignored, it grows stronger. But when it is faced with dignity, it loses its power." Those words spread quickly. They were quoted in newspapers, shared on social media, and repeated in classrooms and offices. Meanwhile, the bank itself had to face the truth. The higher authorities held meetings, trying to understand how such an incident had taken place. They reviewed their policies, they spoke to their staff, and they promised to train employees better so that no customer would be treated unfairly again. For them, the incident was a wake-up call, a reminder that leadership must be rooted in fairness. Inside the bank, the atmosphere began to change. The clerks greeted customers with warmer smiles. The security guard stood a little straighter, showing more kindness in his gestures. The staff spoke more gently, making sure no one felt judged or doubted. It was as if the shadow of that day still lived inside those walls, guiding them to do better. She, on the other hand, carried on with her work. She attended her meetings, completed her projects, and lived her life with the same discipline she always had. Yet, something had changed within her too. She realized her story had become more than her own. It had become a lesson for many people, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when prejudice replaces truth. Sometimes, strangers stopped her on the street just to thank her. They told her they had heard the story and that it gave them courage. Some said they had faced similar situations in silence, but her strength had shown them that they too could speak up. Each word of gratitude touched her heart, reminding her that her actions had meaning beyond that one day. The former bank manager lived with regret. He avoided people, for he knew that many looked at him with disappointment. His pride had turned to shame, and he understood too late that his choice had cost him his career and his reputation. Perhaps, in time, he too would learn the value of respect, but for now, he remained silent, carrying the weight of his mistake. Her story, however, continued to grow. Schools invited her to speak to students. Community leaders asked her to attend events. At each place, she carried the same message: dignity, truth, and respect must guide our actions. She never raised her voice, never spoke with anger, but her calm words carried more strength than loud speeches ever could. One day, she stood before a group of young students who listened to her with wide eyes. She told them, "You may face unfairness in life. People may judge you without knowing you. But remember, your truth is stronger than their doubt. If you stand with patience and dignity, the world will see who you really are. The students clapped, their hearts filled with new courage. Some of them would carry those words for years, reminding themselves whenever life became difficult. She also reminded people that forgiveness mattered too. While she had fired the manager, she did not hate him. She explained, he made a mistake, and he faced the result. But holding hatred in our hearts only makes us weaker. We must correct wrongs, but we must not let anger live inside us. Those words surprised many, but they admired her even more for them. The bank became a symbol of change. Customers often spoke about how different the staff seemed now. They felt welcomed, respected, and valued. The story of the day the FBI saluted a young woman became part of the city's memory, told again and again whenever people spoke about courage and fairness. For her, the greatest reward was not the respect she received, not the attention from the media, but the quiet knowledge that her actions had helped others. She had shown that even in the face of unfair judgment, dignity could win. She had shown that silence was not the answer, but calm strength was. Months later, when she walked past the bank again, she noticed how the staff greeted every customer with care. She saw smiles on their faces, heard kindness in their voices, and felt pride in knowing she had been part of that change. She did not need to enter, she only stood for a moment, then walked away with a peaceful smile. Her life continued, filled with new projects and responsibilities, but that one day remained special. It was a reminder to her and to everyone who knew the story that one act of courage could create waves of change. She had not set out to become a symbol, but life had chosen her for that role. And she carried it with grace. The customers who had been present that day never forgot the scene. They often told the story to others, describing the silence, the salute, and the way she had spoken with such calm strength. Each time the story was told, it grew not in size but in meaning, because its lesson was timeless. In the end, her journey was not just about firing a manager. It was about firing prejudice, about removing unfairness from places where trust should live. It was about teaching people that respect is not optional, it is necessary. As time went on, her story became an inspiration not just in her community but in many others. People repeated her words, shared her interviews, and carried her message into their own lives. She had turned a painful experience into a powerful lesson, and that was her true victory. She proved that dignity does not shout, it speaks softly but carries far. She proved that truth may be tested, but it always stands tall. And she proved that respect, once demanded with calm courage, cannot be denied. Her legacy was not written on paper but in the hearts of those who had heard her story. And every time someone chose fairness over judgment, every time someone showed respect instead of doubt, her influence lived on. That was the true ending, not just the firing of a manager, not just the salute of officials, but the quiet, lasting change she inspired in countless lives. And that, more than anything else, was her greatest victory.